people are capable of committing horrible crimes against other human beings. Some of the things that have been done to others are totally mind-boggling, unbelievable, unthinkable. Then you have another kind of people who know about the crime and support and protect those animals. This morning in our text, we are going to see a group of men capable of torturing and slowly killing an innocent woman. Then another group will protect those murderers and refuse to turn them over to answer for their crime. Today we will see the story of a Levite concubine. The story is in Judges chapter 19. So please turn to our text, Judges 19. First, you need to know two things. Number one, what is a Levite? And number two, what is a concubine? Number one, the Levites were descendants from the tribe of Levi, the third son of Jacob. They were chosen by God in Deuteronomy 10:8 for holy service. Their job was to assist the priest with the sacrifices, to set up and take down the tabernacle of meeting, to carry it, as well as carry all the articles inside of it. They were also involved with the worship ministry, and they made repairs as needed to the temple. They were the equivalent of a deacon today. They were given a gift as a gift to the priest to help them in the book of Numbers chapter 8. They were to serve full time for 25 years, from age 25 to age 50. Something wrong. Why am I still here? Age 50, they retired in Numbers 8:24. They handled the money. They distributed the tithes, 2 Chronicles 31. In times of war, they preceded the army, singing and playing the trumpet in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And they also prepared the sacrifices, cutting, killing for the priests in 2 Chronicles 35. In the Jewish religion, that position still exists today. There are about 12,000 Levites in Canada, 16,000 Levites in France, 3,000 Levites in India, and over 240,000 in Israel. Today, they serve as ritual caretakers of the temple or the synagogue. Now, a concubine was an unmarried woman who did not have the full sanction of a legal marriage. In Old Testament times, concubines were not given any endowment and had no wedding ceremony. In our story today, the man had never met the parents of his concubine. Today, concubines are called domestic partners. Sounds better than a mistress. What were the reason to have a concubine or to be a concubine? But the reason for men to have one of those was sexual pleasure and produce additional children. The reason for the women to be one was financial security. Her duties were simple. She existed solely and completely for the entertainment and sexual gratification of her man. For an unmarried man, like in our story today, the sin is fornication. For a married man to take a concubine, the sin is adultery. We have today the first case of a man and a woman living together outside of marriage. They were not blessed by God. Why not? Because God cannot bless people living in sin. We continue with one of the most disturbing stories in the Bible. In this story, we will see many evils. We will see cohabitation problems, separation, a running away partner, wicked homosexuals, gang rape, murder, decapitation, mutilation, and covering sin. It's a good thing we have a Sunday school for the children. Kids should not be here for this study. So this story starts in verse 1. To pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah. And she was there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and he went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having a servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. It is important to notice the timing of this story. When did it take place? We are told in chapter 21, verse 25, in those days everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is a terrible time. This gives us a clue, a picture of the moral condition of that nation. When there are no rules, when everybody is allowed to do whatever seems right in their own eyes, you have nothing but chaos, madness, and confusion. If there were no rules in Fairfield, just today, everyone could do what is right in his or her own eyes. You could not get home today. People would drive any which way. They would disregard traffic lights, stop signs. They would carjack the car that they want. They would kill whomever is in their way. Aren't you glad we have some rules? So that's the background of this story. This particular Levite is not mentioned by name, but he is not Micah's Levite that is mentioned earlier in chapter 17. Even though they both had connections with the mountains of Ephraim. Having that position of spiritual authority, this Levite should have been a good example of a spiritual leader, but he was not. He was a terrible, sinful man. We will see that there were several things wrong with this man. Number one, he took for himself a concubine, verse 1, instead of getting married. This might have been permitted by the law of the land, but it was never approved by God. You can read Matthew 19:5. He decided, like many people today, to live with this woman outside of wedlock. No arrangements were made by the parents. They were simply living together. He probably said, like so many people say today, how can a piece of paper make a difference? made a big difference. Number two, he was not a loving man. Had he nourished and cherished her like a good husband, she would not have played the harlot against him in verse 2. She would not have departed and returned to her father's house. When the perverted men of the city will surround the house, this man will throw her out to be abused by those people when we get to verse 25. And number three, he was a mean, rough individual. When she will lay on the ground at the door, his words to her will be, "Get out," verse 28. And he will not even try to help her to get up. He had no compassion. He was a jerk, a bad witness for a spiritual leader. It is sad that this woman or any other women accept this deal of cohabitation instead of marriage. Men have certain responsibilities towards their wife, given by God, that they do not have with a concubine. God asked the men to love their wives as they love their own bodies in Ephesians 5:28. Men are to give honor to their wife as the weaker vessel and have compassion for her. Be tender-hearted and courteous, 1 Peter 3. This Levite did not fulfill those responsibilities because she was not his wife. He mistreated her and she left him. She had another affair with another man, and she returned back to her father's house. She could not file for legal separation, could not file for divorce. She was not legally married to him. Living together is never an acceptable substitute. In verses 4 to 10, the father of the girl, so excited to finally meet his daughter's partner, he detained him in verse 4, and they parted day after day. After 4 days, the Levite was ready to go home in verse 5, but the father of the girl offered him more food to try to keep him, and they drank together another day in verse 6. This man tried to depart without success. Make you wonder, when did these men work? Who has time to party 3-4 days? On the 5th day, the father tried again to keep him one more day, but the Levite would not. That was enough. He decided to leave in the afternoon, verse 8. And it was not a good decision. He waited too long. The father said that it will be dark and they will not find a place to lodge, in verse 9. Still, he was not willing to spend another night there. He had enough. He departed with his concubine, with his servant, and his 2 donkeys. In verses 11 to 21, we have the details of their journey. It was late afternoon when they came to Jebus. Jebus is Jerusalem today. His servant suggested that they lodge there. Let's stop here and sleep here, verse 11. But the Levite declined the suggestion because that city was still inhabited by some heathen Jebusites. Verse 12. Israel had not gotten rid of all of them yet. There was still heathen living in the city. It would have been better for them to spend the night there with the heathen than with the professed children of God. They were worse than the heathen. It is sad, but at times believers behave worse than unbelievers. At sunset, they came to Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin, verse 13. No one offered to provide lodging. Not one was hospitable. The Levite stayed in the open square, verse 15. Then an old Ephraimite man who was living in Gibeah, verse 16, told him it was not safe to stay in the open square at night, verse 20. So he offered to take them to his home, and they accepted. The story continues in verse 22. As they were enjoying themselves in the house, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally," or sexually. But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the man would not heed him. So the man took his concubine, and he brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night long until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was till it was light. Here we have a repeat story of the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. While they were enjoying the evening, some wicked homosexual men of Gibeah, like the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, they surrounded the house and demanded that the old men send out the Levite to satisfy their homosexual desires. Considering the laws of hospitality in those days, more important than good manners towards the opposite sex, the old man offered his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead of his male guests in verse 22, 23, 24. Women had no status in those days. But to homosexual, offering women was an insult. It is not what they wanted. They were not interested. So the homosexual refused the old man's offer. Then the coward Levite shoved his concubine outside to them and closed the door. Verse 25. Frustrated and revengeful, the homosexual took her and sexually abused her throughout the night. She was gang raped. At daybreak, they released her, and she fell at the door of the house and could not move. Verse 26. Not only did the Levite throw his concubine to those perverted men, but he was able to lie down and sleep well while they were abusing her in the street. What kind of a man does that? How insensitive can a man's heart be? A religious man. The story goes on, verse 27. Then her master arose in the morning. Look how God labeled him. Her master. He doesn't say her husband. She was her master. Arose in the morning and opened the door of the house, and he went out to go his way. And there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, "No such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came out from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up." So when the Levite got up, he opened the door. He found his concubine at the door with her hands on the threshold. Thinking that she was asleep, he told her to get up, but she was dead. He placed her on his donkey and he went home. Once he got home, he performed an almost unbelievable cruelty. He cut up his concubine limb by limb. He dismembered her into 12 pieces, and he sent one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. It says in verse 30 that no such thing had ever been seen or done. Imagine the mayor or the city supervisor today receiving a leg or a torso in the mail. While this is difficult for modern readers to understand, what he did here was meant to move the nation to action. They were never doing anything. He called for a national judicial hearing. He wanted the nation as a whole to wake up and do something about it. Many years later, the prophet Hosea mentioned this evil act a few times in his prophecy in Hosea chapter 9 and chapter 10. By the way, who do we know from Gibeah? There's a man that we know, King Saul. When he was called to be the king, he said, "Am I not from the smallest of all the tribes, the tribe of Benjamin?" We will see him later, and we will see how small he was. The story goes on in chapter 20. So all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, as well as from the land of Gilead, and the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. And the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. Then the children of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this wicked deed happen?" So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, "My concubine and I went to Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. And the men of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me, but instead they ravished," which is raped, "my concubine so that she died. So I took hold of my concubine, cut her in pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of the inheritance of Israel, because they committed lewdness and outrage in Israel." Look all of you are children of Israel. Give your advice and counsel here and now. So in response to the Levite's delivery, the pieces that he had mailed, and his request for an investigation, all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, north to south, and from the land of Gilead, they assembled together in verse 1. Gilead refers to the tribe on the other side of the Jordan. They gathered before the Lord at Mizpah, 400,000 men. That's a gathering. The Benjamites were not officially represented at Mizpah. However, the tribe of Benjamin had received one of the 12 parts of the concubine. They knew what had been done. So the group asked for an explanation in verse 3. The Levite explained the circumstances of his concubine's rape and death in verses 4 and 5. And he asked Israel for a verdict. In verses 8 to 11, the verdict was unanimous. All the people rose as one man against the town of Gibeah, verse 9, where the crime took place, to give them what they deserved. They launched an attack. 10%, 40,000 men of the Israelite troop, collected supplies for the 360,000 who did the fighting in verse 10. All the men were assembled as one man. Then verse 12, the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this wickedness that has occurred among you? Now therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men who are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and remove the evil from Israel." But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of their brethren, the children of Israel. Instead, the children of Benjamin gathered together from their cities to Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. The 11 tribes had agreed as one man to attack Gibeah. But first they gave the Benjamite an opportunity to deliver the guilty, perverted men for punishment. We do not know exactly how many men were involved with the rape and murder, but they were willing to go to war and protect those evil men rather than turn them in. When the Benjamites refused, civil war broke out, verse 14. The Benjamites did not admit their guilt, nor repented of their sins. Instead, they got ready for battle. They would not judge their own people. They were tolerant of sin. There can be no peace unless sin is put away. Only the death of those rapists and murderers could remove the sinful blemish from Israel. They had to go. In verses 15 to 25, we have the details of the war. Having rejected the request to deliver the wicked, the Benjamite mobilized 26,000 swordmen in verse 15, plus 700 left-handed men from Gibeah, who were all expert with slings. Most likely, the guilty people were from that group. Before starting anything, the men of Israel went to inquire of the Lord. Verse 18. That sounds good, but they did not really inquire the Lord's will. They did not ask, Lord, shall we go against them or not? They made up their mind to go. Their mind was made up already. They said, we are going. So, Lord, which one shall go first? They asked amiss, as James said. So they experienced defeat at the hand of the Benjamite in verse 21. Yes, their cause was right. The Benjamite had done terrible things, but they were not seeking the Lord about what to do. They were only seeking the Lord how to do it in order, the order in which to go. They assume, sure, God wants us to go after those wicked people right now and teach them a lesson. We have the tendency to do the same thing. When we see that the cause is right, we react quickly. Yes, let's do it. We assume it is God's will. And often what we do is not according to the will of God. Instead, we should ask God to come up with the plan that He has. He has a plan. What is your plan, Lord? Don't worry about my plan. It's useless. I want your plan. The tribe of Benjamin had only 26,700 soldiers against 400,000 from the other tribes. And yet, in the first battle, Benjamin killed 22,000 men, verses 18 to 21. In the second round of combat, 18,000 men of Israel were killed, verses 22 to 25. Now 40,000 men are gone. The reason why Israel had such a hard time, even though their cause was right, was because they themselves were not close to the Lord. It is important to let God make the plan. We should not make our own plans and then go to God and ask for His approval of those plans. The men of Israel decided to go against the men of Gibeah without asking God. Then they asked God how to do it. Who was going first? They should have asked God first if they should go or not, and then ask how to do it. So the story continues in verse 26. Then all the children of Israel, that is all the people, they went up and came to the house of God, and they wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So the children of Israel inquired of the Lord. The ark of the covenant of God was there in those days, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days, saying, shall I yet again go out to battle against the children of my brother Benjamin, or shall I cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand. The second defeat motivated the Israelites to return to Bethel, where they wept before the Lord. They fasted. They presented burnt offerings, fellowship offerings to the Lord. Maybe the reason for the Lord to allow those defeats was to bring them back to repentance. God often does that. Don't go too far. Come back and talk with me. Then they inquired of the Lord in verse 27. This time they did not only get a yes, go, They got the plan of God and the promise of victory from God. What an encouragement to go when God promises to give you the victory. In verses 29 to 35, we have a general account of the defeat of the Benjamites. In the third deployment, the Israelites used the strategy of ambush that they were told to do by God. They drew the men of Benjamin away from the city of Gibeah. They set the city on fire and then destroyed a total of 25,100 Benjamites out of 25,700. In verses 36 to 45, we have a more detailed account of the battle. The turning point of the battle came when the Israelites, waiting in ambush, set the city on fire. Seeing the smoke behind, threw the Benjamite into confusion, verses 40 and 41. When the Israelites, both in front of them and behind them, the Benjamin had no choice but to flee into the wilderness. By the third day, 25,000 Benjamites had died. Only 600 survived, we are told in verse 47. The Israelites then went throughout the territory of Benjamin and killed all the people, the animals that they encountered, and they burned their town. Since the Benjamites had not handed over the men of Gibeah, the entire tribe ended sharing in Gibeah's punishment. The whole city paid for the crime of these few that they protected. Their destruction was similar to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. It is dangerous to be tolerant. It is dangerous to side with a sinner or to protect a sinner. Whatever punishment is due to that sinner will come to those helping and protecting. The tribe of Benjamin sided with the men of Gibeah. They refused to turn them in. They hid them. That was a big mistake. As a result, they died with the perverted men that they were trying to protect. They got what the guilty people deserve. Chapter 21 deals with the rebuilding of the tribe of Benjamin that had been destroyed for covering the sin of the wicked people of that tribe. Verses 1 to 4, the Israelites took an oath not to give any of the daughters in marriage to a Benjamite. They even called down a curse upon anyone who would do so. But how were these 600 Benjamites going to keep their tribe in existence without wives? The Israelites began to have a second thought about what they had done to Benjamin. They clearly had gone too far when they killed all the women and children and the non-fighting men. They did not have to kill those innocent people. If those 600 men had not escaped, the tribe of Benjamin would have been totally destroyed. There would be 11 tribes of Israel. In verses 5 to 15, the Israelites devised a plan by which to obtain wives for the 600 Benjamites. One community had not attended the meeting where the oath was taken, Jabesh Gilead, in verse 8. So they destroyed Jabesh Gilead, and they spared the 400 virgin girls found there and gave them to the Benjamites. In verses 16 to 25, being short by 200 women, the Israelites came up with another scheme. they told the 200 Benjamites without wives to go to the yearly feast in Shiloh, verse 19, and to catch a girl while they performed their dances. Dangerous for girls to dance. And they were all virgin. Now, with 600 couples, the tribe of Benjamin started to rebuild. It never became a large tribe, but at least the original 12 tribes continued to exist. We learned that God's people need to deal with sin in their lives, in their home, in their camp, in their marriage. Unconfessed sin is like an uncontrolled disease. It spreads, it kills. The men of Benjamin would not have been killed had they confessed and dealt with the sin of the men of Gibeah rather than hiding them. They should have turned them in to be condemned for their crime, but they did not. Now, people read this story and immediately remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Some people question the fairness of God. In Sodom and Gomorrah, no one was raped. No one died. And yet both cities were completely destroyed by God. In Gibeah, a woman was gang raped and died, and God did not destroy the city. At first glance, it may look unfair, but we must be careful before we accuse God of being unfair. We are not told what the population of Sodom and Gomorrah was, but it was not that big. When both cities were taken captive in Genesis 14, and Abraham had to go and rescue his nephew Lot from there, the population was 10 to 20,000 people at the most. The tribe of Benjamin totaled 45,600 when the second census was conducted in the book of Numbers, chapter 26. Here, about 250 years later, they could easily have been over 80,000, 90,000 people. God actually destroyed more people in Gibeah than he did in Sodom and Gomorrah. We must not be too quick to accuse God. On the surface, it may look at times that God is unfair, but when you do your homework, you will see that God is just and fair. He never plays favorite. He made sure the men of Gibeah, Benjamin were punished just as the men of Sodom and Gomorrah were. The Bible is clear. The wages of sin is death. What a story. An unhappy couple living together did not keep themselves in the love of God. Had they kept themselves in the love of God, God would have blessed them, but he could not. As a result, they paid a terrible price. She was tortured. She was killed. The men tried to get justice, but the criminals were protected. The country ended up in a civil war and almost destroyed an entire tribe. Had this Levite man done what is right and properly married that woman and performed his responsibilities towards his wife and loved her, this story would not be in the Bible. But refusing to keep themselves in the love of God, refusing to keep themselves in a place where God can bless them, they paid a terrible price. Next week, we are going to move to the book of Ruth and take the story of the first man that we meet there, Elimelech, the husband of Naomi. Two main lessons from our text. Number one, if you want to be blessed by God, don't do your own thing. It won't happen. You will not be blessed by the Lord doing your own thing. You do what the Lord asks us to do. And the other lesson, do not side with the sinner. It's not safe. When God comes after the sinner, He will take you with Him, like they took the entire Benjamite for covering the Gileadite. So for the small group that they protected, they paid a big price. It is best not to cover for sinners. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord bless your home and your family this week. May He touch your heart today. May you examine your own heart and see about siding with sinner or seeking blessing from God while doing your own thing. Trust the Lord. Walk with the Lord all the days of your life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.